Okay, our goal today is to do rhetorical studies. So that'll be our focus for the day. And before I get going, does anybody have questions or thoughts? You did a lot of intense reading this time. So it's probably pushing you to places you've never been before in your mind. You know, Foss is easy to read. Sonia Foss is fairly, with the invitational rhetoric, and that was about it. That was easy to read. You know, Burke is impossible to begin with, so you just deal with that. Wikipedia is your best friend when you're trying to read Burke. And Aristotle is dense, and we'll talk about why. You know, I always find it hard to read Aristotle, the rhetoric anyway. So we'll talk about that. And then what else? You read the spirituality article, which is hard to get into. You know, part of what you're dealing with here is that communication studies, that in rhetoric especially, borrows richly from a lot of literature. And so if you're not tuned in on that literature, you're just like, what is he talking about? Especially with Burke, because Burke is like an omnivore. He just read everything that there was, and so he just brings it in out of nowhere, and so it becomes very challenging. But I'll lead you through it, and we'll make a little more sense out of it. Any other questions though? Let me just take attendance.
You know what was interesting was the discussion about the Holy Trinity. And you know, I'd never heard anybody explain, you know, what was meant by the Holy Ghost. It was the first time I'd ever seen somebody take a shot at it.
Really?
Yeah, that sort of made sense to me anyway.
Good.
I was wondering if that made sense to you.
Well, we'll look at it together. You know, I didn't necessarily was going to do a theology lecture out of this. I was going to do
I just kind of noted it as I was reading.
Yeah.
This is the first time I've ever heard that actually laid out in a way that where the person didn't sound annoyed that I'd asked the question.
Right. No, well, when you start to get into Bacon, you start to get into Aquinas, you start to realize that people did some pretty sophisticated thinking in the past, and we don't always contact that. We think like we're just at the top of the heap, and we think better than anybody else ever thought.
Like the angels on the pin thing.
Right, we make fun of the scholastics,
right.
But there's a lot there in terms of communication and how does that work, and how would one mind communicate to another mind. So, what's the role of language and signs? So
all of their like thinking and writing, if they are persuasive, it would fall under one or the other tradition. Like,
what's that now?
Well, you know, I don't know. I guess I'm just kind of confused, like definition about it. Like, you know, like sometimes it's used for like all like speaking and writing and stuff. So
yes.
For this case, if it's not strictly persuasive, it would fall under one of the other traditions.
No. I'll talk about the different scope of what rhetoric engages. And I think Foss overstates her case a little bit, that rhetoric is only about persuasion. So we'll get into that. But no, I think rhetorical studies has a very broad field to it. It does certainly look at the questions of persuasion, but it's also, there's a whole dimension to the issue of the contingent and the pragmatic that is not reflected in some of what you read. That has to do with questions that have no correct answer. So for instance, if I asked you, you know, how many square feet of floor is there here? We could figure that out and have a correct answer to it, you know. But if we ask you, well, who should be the next president of the United States? Or, you know, where did our Iraq policy break down? Or something like that. It's kind of hard to count it up and say this is the correct answer. So rhetoric has a lot to do with when there are contingent answers. Well, in this case, if you look at it this way or if you look at it that way, or what's the best course for us to take, in practical matters, rhetoric is significant, and the whole idea of how a community deliberates about its practical choices is a significant part of rhetoric. That so like Foss, you know, if I were faculty somewhere or in a conference somewhere, I might have an argument with her about her rhetoric of imitation really being a dialogic theory that should be phenomenological. So, you know, we could talk about those things. These are just people trying their best. What I want to do then today is to start off with just general talk about rhetoric and make sure we understand some of the history of it. I don't know how much history you have of rhetorical studies, but it's good to get a sense of it. The word itself, of course, comes from Aristotle, who wrote or who gave lectures on rhetoric and whose notes were gathered under that title, the rhetoric. Now, I would encourage you, so I'll just put Aristotle down here. Now, Aristotle, of course, wrote other things, you know, wrote a number of other works. And this is the collected notes, or some student-edited notes. So it doesn't have the flow, it doesn't have the coherence that you might want from it. So if you were to do textual criticism, this is not a completed text by an author. This is gathered materials, but nonetheless it's fairly complete. And as you read in your little excerpt of the rhetoric, you know, he goes through very systematically. That was Aristotle's method, was to go painfully systematically through things. And so he gives us this. Now, before Aristotle, of course, was Plato, who was Aristotle's mentor. And then you go one step back, and you have Socrates. And so you pick up Socrates in the Gorgias, but Gorgias is written by Plato. So that's the way this works. So we really have Socrates as represented by Plato and Gorgias as represented by Plato in this particular setting. But just to get a grip on, in our Western tradition of speech communication, this is the earliest we go, except you go into Homeric and Iliad, you know, Odyssey and Iliad literature about how communication works. But this is the first place where people are trying to think theoretically about communication. They're trying to ask questions, what's going on? How do we do this effectively? Is it possible to train a person to be a good speaker? Or is it just something you're born with and the gods gave it to you? You know? Or is it something that can be cultivated? And so that was a debate going on. And they came to the conclusion that it could be learned, it could be taught, and it could be developed. So just as there are some people who are natural at something, and they do it by their nature, they do it by their innate skills, there are other people who could learn those skills by observing people who do things by nature. So I suppose this is true in theater. A couple of our people here are theater, and some people are just naturals at it. You know, they can just do things, they have a stage presence, they're good. Other people have to study them, break it down into a method, and begin to learn a method. But it can be taught, it can be learned. So it's an art that can be communicated. Now, the early situation for the Greeks was that there had been wars in the Greek city-states. And so people, like you would have property, and there would be a war and you'd lose your property. You know, you'd flee in exile for a while and then you'd come back when the tide turned and there's someone living in your property. And so you were faced with a dilemma of, I want my property back. And the other people were there saying, excuse me, we've been here for 10 years cultivating this property, you know, why should we give you the property? So what the Athenians decided to do was to have courts where there would be a large group of jury from the citizenry, and everyone was allowed to make their case, but you had to make your own case. You could not hire a lawyer to speak for you. You had to make your own case. So given the fact that some people are natural at speaking and other people aren't, it became now all of a sudden a market for people to train you to present your case, because you had an economic interest in being able to present your case well. And so teachers of speech emerged, who were known as the sophists. Now, sophists have a varied reputation historically. Plato hated them, so he paints them in a very poor way. And in his worst representation of sophists, they were money-grabbing people who could care less about what truth was or what the right thing was, who would just teach you to win the argument by swaying the emotions of the people who heard you. So they would train you to make a sob story pitch, and you would get the land even if it had not even been yours before. So Plato saw the minds of the jury, or the will of the jury, being warped by emotional appeals. And so he was against this. He thought this was horrible. On the best take on the sophists is that they were the first teachers of speech who were concerned to give people the ability to present their case well, to give people a voice in the court systems and the court structure, so that we would call them today empowerers of people, to have a voice, you know, and to be able to speak up for their own rights and their own needs. And one of the most famous of the sophists at the time was Gorgias. And you read the dialogue, and we'll go over that dialogue a little bit. But and Socrates was around at this time, and you can read in Plato's dialogue with Socrates here this idea, or the method of Socrates was to engage in dialogue or dialectic, you know, back and forth, short conversation. So Socratic method is the idea of asking questions and drawing out things by short back and forth answers. So if we were teaching this course Socratically, we'd be doing this differently than we're doing it now. It's kind of hard to do with a bunch of people, but you would teach it Socratically that way. Now, Ben, I don't know if you took pedagogical coursework, you know, learning theory and all that stuff.
Yeah, the Socratic method is kind of stressful, actually, for some students, because the teacher would stand there with a list and say, Ben, what happened in 1875, blah, blah, blah. And if you weren't prepared, that looks stupid.
Oh, okay.
You know, I mean, that's okay. But,
yeah.
You know,
in its best form, Socratic method draws out of the student the answers. I mentioned to you before that part of the philosophy, and you get this a little bit in the article on the spiritualist tradition too, part of the philosophy was that you never create knowledge. The knowledge is already pre-existing, and what we're doing is remembering it or gathering it out of somebody. So we'd find.
I was going to say they use it in law school a lot, and I think it's really helpful there.
Okay.
At least they say it is.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what that would look like.
In law school, they would say what happened in such and such case, because they read cases. All
Okay, and then people have to keep.
People say, what were the facts of this
responding
case?
to cases.
Right. What was the dilemma?
Yeah, draw it out. Drawing it out is the theme of the Socratic method. So Socrates tries to draw out of Gorgias an explanation of what he does.
I know the sophists taught like public speaking, but did they teach like interpersonal speaking with it, or was it more just for like the masses? Because like this.
Well, it was not for the masses; it was for the courts. Yeah.
Wasn't that like because it was like hundreds of people.
Right, in the jury, yeah. Okay, so it was...
But did they teach it like...
I don't...
It's like the
I've never heard anything about teaching a course in interpersonal communication or group process, you know, by the sophists.
Because like to do the Socratic method, you need like one-on-one. I didn't know
Yes.
if people taught like that too.
I don't know. I don't know. The peripatetics, the walking philosophers, tended to do this. They tended to, rather than give huge lectures on things, they talked together. Because that was what Aristotle will say in the opening of the Rhetoric, that rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. And dialectic is calm, friendly exchange around absolute truth and philosophical questions. So there was a form of conversation known as dialectic, which is different from our dialectic. But it was the way in which you sought after absolute truth. And
Dance, right?
what's that?
The
There was a dance. Call it.
they were talking about last week.
Well, it was a back and forth to cooperate to discover what we already had know from when our souls were in the spirit world. Because we knew everything then, and we've forgotten it when we came here. So if we talk enough to each other, we'll remember it. That was their philosophy about it. So yeah, rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. So you had the sophists doing their thing, and it became an issue about the good or the virtuous person who believed in and stood for the truth. The Greeks had a whole tradition of virtue theory. They had a whole concept of the virtuous person. And so there developed kind of two streams of rhetoric. You had your Gorgias stream of rhetoric, which was how can we win the argument no matter what the truth is, if you take Plato's look at him. And then you had the other stream, which was the question of how does a person train themselves to help the truth prevail in a argumentative setting. So you had a number of authors, like Socrates is a name we won't do much with, but Socrates was a sophistic person. He was a teacher of public speech, but he insisted that his students practice this power ethically. He said, I'm going to teach you a great power to persuade people and to move their emotions and to move their will, but I'm also going to teach you at the same time how to manage that power in a moral way, in an ethical way. So we talk later with Quintilian and Cicero about a good man speaking well. That was the goal. A good man, of course, good person speaking well. But that you had to not only teach them the ability to speak, but the goodness that they would use their power in the right way. So Socrates gives us the dialogue. Plato writes the dialogue with Socrates and Gorgias. Plato prefers the philosopher king to democracy. Plato is not going to recommend that in the Republic we have a democracy, but that it is ruled by people who are skilled in dialectic, and that everybody finds their place under the leadership of the philosopher kings. So that's very anti-democratic, in case you're not figuring that out. And so, because rhetoric often comes into play in a more democratic process where people speak, where we have deliberation, and we choose. But Plato was not in favor of that because he was looking at the sophists and seeing that you could twist people's minds by emotional appeals and distort their judgment. And so that was bad. Now Aristotle comes along, and he kind of finds the middle ground in this. He says, yeah, philosophy is great, dialectic is important and all, but not everybody is a philosopher. Not everybody is going to engage in dialectic. The crowds, the masses can't. So it becomes important then for good people to be trained in speaking so they can compete with bad people who are good speakers. Because if one of Aristotle's statements is that truth has a natural tendency to prevail. So the truth, you put the truth in an even playing field, it has a natural tendency to win. But if you put truth in a playing field with bad people who are skilled speakers and good people who are poorly trained speakers, the bad people may win because they know how to persuade people that this is not the truth. So part of Aristotle's goal is to train people to participate with the truth in prevailing. Now there's another dimension to this as well, and that is in a civic setting or in a city, there are always decisions that have to be made about taxes, how much taxes should we charge, what should we do about the army, should we build more ships, should we build a better wall, should we build a moat around the city, should we build statues to our past leaders. There's all these questions that are practical and contingent questions, that there is no where you can go to find the answer. You can't measure it, count it, go to the answer book and find out. So there are some questions that can be answered by research, right? How many square feet of floor is there here? We could answer that, and there would be a right answer and a wrong answer. And I could show you how we got the right answer. But if we say, should we build the wall higher around the city, what's the right answer? There is no way to find the right answer somewhere. So what we're left with is that we have to talk with each other and deliberate. So we have to deliberate around practical and contingent issues that we deal with. And in that, it becomes very important to examine both sides of the argument. It becomes very important to have the pros and cons evaluated. So we have a science or an art now of training people to look at issues of argument and to prove opposites. So this is the statement that rhetoric teaches people to prove opposites. What does that mean? Well, it means that the rhetorically trained person asks, given this situation, what are the available means of persuasion? What are the possibilities for making arguments for and against this? So if I'm a rhetorically trained person and we ask, should we build the city wall higher? I immediately start to think, well, what are the pro arguments and what are the con arguments? And I begin to say, well, the city next door got defeated because they had small walls. There's one argument. We should spend that money on ships instead of walls. So I put it down and I construct the best arguments for both sides so that I am able to prove either side of the argument. And then I have to consult somewhere else to think about, well, what do I think is the right one? And then I become an advocate for that. But before I become an advocate, I evaluate both sides, the proofs available in all cases. So it requires me to evaluate the thing. And so in the courts, if I'm in a court case, there were 3 places where rhetoric was practiced, right? It was practiced in the political realm, it was practiced in the forensic or the legal realm, and it was practiced in the ceremonial realm. dedicating a building, dedicating a statue, funeral oration, you know, these kinds of things. So it had multiple dimensions to it. It became very important as the city-states moved towards democracy, because that meant then that we would be deliberating rather than someone telling us what to do. Now, of course, their democracy excluded a number of groups of people, right? The Athenian democracy excluded women, it excluded slaves, and it excluded people who didn't own land. But that was closer to democracy than anything else had been at that point. So we talk about it that way. So rhetoric enters the situation, and Aristotle said then, so the study of rhetoric is the discovery of what are the available means of persuasion in any case. And he ruled out coercive persuasion, like beating people up, you know, or serving them with a warrant, you know, or something. He said, we're not talking about that kind of persuasion. We're talking about verbal, argumentative, deliberative persuasion. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and ask if anybody has any thoughts or questions about rhetoric. So this is a tradition. It's one of our traditions. Any thoughts or questions? No? Unless we've been through this 100 times, right? And if you all know this already, tell me. No? Some of it's familiar? All right.
But since not everyone is taking it through.
Okay. Yeah, all right. Well, we'll go ahead and keep going here for a little bit. So so Kenneth Burke is going to come along and talk about a new rhetoric, you know, or a rhetoric of motives, what, you know, part of our tradition is that this got lost for many years, this whole way of looking at things. So Aristotle's rhetoric, by the time you get to Augustine in 400 or so, you have where it's been suppressed as part of classical learning. And the church has emerged out of the barbarian invasions as being sort of in charge. And they're putting away any other writings at that point. But Augustine is trained as a rhetorical scholar. And he becomes a bishop of the church. And he argues for bringing rhetorical training into the life of the church for the clergy, because the clergy were horrible speakers. And Augustine comes out of a non-church background into the church, as trained as a rhetorician, comes into the church. All these people are lousy speakers. He says, why should people with the truth have the lousiest speakers in the world? You know, who bore people and who don't engage people's wills and minds and emotions. So we should use this to train the clergy to speak well. So there are recoveries of Aristotelian rhetoric as time goes on. More recently for us, in the 1940s, there was Perelman rediscovered Aristotle's rhetoric again and brought it back into common use. So we're living in a time of rhetorical renaissance ourselves. So there's more interest in this than there was for many, many years. So of course you have your common, your logos, your pathos, your ethos. Aristotle argues that there are three main proofs that you can use, three types of proof. You can use logical proof, you can use emotional proof, and you can use the credibility of your character as support for your argument. So if you were doing a rhetorical analysis of something, these are things you would look for. You would ask, what is the speaker's logical arguments? What are the emotional appeals that they're making? What are the emotions that they're stirring? And are they credible? Do they come across as intelligent? Do they come across as a good person? And are they well-intentioned towards me? Those are the three dimensions of ethos. And so Aristotle argued if you have good logical arguments, if you're moving people's emotions, if you have good credibility, you're in good shape for making your argument. And this is, research has been done on this, and it's, it's supported by research findings as well. But Aristotle was in some ways the first psychologist, the first student of